It may have happened to you, either in linear or open world games, that the title presents multiple endings. At times there can be achieved either in the adventure or depend the player's choice throughout the entirety of the journey. Every more occasionally, endings are ranked and there's only one quote-unquote true ending to be achieved. But does the true ending really enhance the plot of a game by enriching it, or is it more of an excuse for the player to play more of a title that he or she already completed? First things first, roll the intro. Before starting this conversation, I want to highlight the fact that the games shown in the background may or may not have multiple endings. Of course some of them do, but to keep the discussion as spoiler-free as possible, I do not want to give away too many specific examples. So, going back on track, what is exactly a true ending? There's a difference between having multiple endings on the same level and having different levels of importance for an ending, and thus only one true ending. For instance, if in the adventure you finish the main quest without doing something specific, you may end up in a complete state, where the game's false ending will make it clear that something is off. At times this can happen because the player activates an ending too soon, by completing his or her own task, by clearly missing a good chunk of the game. In other occasions, the player does reach the end of a game, but by not playing as desired by the developers, and does not be awarded with the mystical true ending. Note that true and good endings are not one and the same. There are some games where you can be evil and still canonically finish the adventure as intended. This often happens if factions are involved. But a true ending is the ending the developers intended for the player to achieve, but is deemed to be the final conclusion above the others. So this poses a question: is it fair for the player to be given false endings to make the final true ending more meaningful, improving the player's experience with a game's story and narration, or are these just often a fabrication to dilute a narrative experience? In today's video, I will be discussing why both answers are true in certain cases. True endings certainly can work, but they do need some contextualization and well placement, otherwise they do not enhance the plot of a game as the writers may see fit. As stated before, I will keep the discussion spoiler free and keep the examples to a minimum. Without further ado, let us start this discussion. Unlike books and movies, games not only have the tools to implement different endings in their own adventures, but that it can even do them by using the player's inputs. I suppose those choose your own path novels exist, but come on, they don't hold a candle to video games, where hundreds of hours of micro choices can lead to unique and different endings. If the player is given the possibility to manipulate the structure of a plot by choosing the course of the main story, it is natural to give the player different outcomes. What sense would it make if all choices led to the same destination? This paradigm, however, is not as cyclical as you may imagine. Not all games that have choices have different endings and work just fine, and some games with different endings only require a final decision to be made right before the end credits. The presence of multiple endings is an artistic choice by the developers that wish to give the player a sense of control over the plot of a game. You're the protagonist after all, what will you do to change the world? However, what happens when there is a true ending in place? What if all endings are secondary because the game only has one canonical ending and you need to run that extra mile before reaching it? True endings can come in various shapes and sizes, but in my opinion can be narrowed into three categories. Endings that inevitably come when progressing the game, endings that require you driving the adventure to a certain direction in order to be reached, and endings that require you to play multiple runs of the same game to be unlocked. In the first scenario, true endings are just a fancy way to label the epilogue of a game. It might have happened to you that you have played a game that finished in a cliffhanger, credits roll, but then, after the credits, the final cutscene plays, and you realize that the game's true ending is taking place. Many games do this type of true ending, so perhaps it is better not to mention any particular title for avoiding spoiling the surprise. If I watch all the credits till the end, so can you. True endings like these are not controversial, nor do they deserve too much discussion. I believe it is sensible sometimes to leave the epilogue after the credits to enhance the story's ending. Perhaps in what you believe it was the final cutscene, something big happens, and in reality gets solved, but the solution would be of lesser impact if it came right after the decisive moment. You want to leave the player in disbelief for a few moments before revealing the truth. In the second scenario, true endings are achieved only if the players do something differently than to rush to the conclusion of a game. This can come in various forms, but more often than not, the game's false ending makes it clear to the player that they are missing something. An example would be a game finishing too soon with a very unsatisfactory ending to let you understand that you need to complete that side activity. In Zelda Breath of the Wild, you could finish the main story fairly quickly. Once you have your glider, no one is stopping you to reach Hyrule Castle and facing the final boss with a stick. However, and I will need to keep this vague to avoid spoilers, there's a certain facultative activity that gives meaning to the game's ending, and not doing it results in a different cutscene that hints to the players there is something more to complete. In the first Fallout game, something similar happens. There's one way for you to complete the game by achieving your main quest, but it is clear that you definitely need to carry on with the adventure to truly tie up all loose ends, mainly one. In this type of true endings, the player is not held down if they desire to complete the game as the best see fit. However, the game may look down at the player or even punishing it if they do not aim to obtain the true ending. This is where the question of the video is more heated. Does the narration that ranks your way to complete a game to a quote-unquote true form really improve the game's story, the game's ending? In my opinion, it depends on what type of limitations or punishment the game proposes to the player if he or she is not aiming for the true ending. When the game's false ending is flexible to let the player pick up the adventure 5 minutes before the final boss and achieve that something to progress to the true ending, then such false ending could give more meaning to the true ending that comes later. If the game, however, bases its unlocking of the true ending to a non-repeatable task, then it could be seen as a useless punishment and pickiness from the developers. Imagine playing a game for 20 or more hours just to be told that you did not play it well enough, and if you want to see the true ending of the game, buckle up because you need to replay it all over again, but this time as we want it. I have some examples of games like this, but of course even mentioning their name would be spoiling it. But the point is that it is very frustrating from the player's point of view to be given the freedom to play as one's desire, but ultimately be punished if they fail to play as intended by the developers. In these scenarios, I do not see how the plot is enhanced. Sure, it is admirable the idea of having consequences for different playstyles, but as addressed in introduction, one thing is to have multiple endings on the same level, and one thing is to have an S-tier true ending unlockable for some. A game that for instance does not punish false endings is Nier Automata. This is very hard to describe without doing spoilers, but basically there are some very silly things you can do in the game that would cause a drift in the game's narrative, too big to deal with a linear title like Nier. So the game falsely ends with a sarcastic comment, mocking your often imbecile action, and the game just starts from where you left it. No punishment, just a gag to fill up the quick false ending. Speaking of sarcasm, how could I not mention the Starry Parable, a game known for its many endings. Curiously, the Ultra Deluxe version of the game did add a quote-unquote canonical ending, but again, you're not punished for playing the game differently when achieving other endings, you're even incentivized to do so. So while false endings of this secondary category could theoretically not be inserted in the game's narration, at times they could definitely have a positive impact in both the game's freeability and the plot's enhancement. Generally speaking, I'm not a big fan of the idea of backtracking in order to obtain the one thing that lets me progress to the true ending, but I can definitely see the appeal of using fake endings to hint to the player that there is more to the game than the ending they just reached. The third category of true endings is the one that I truly despise. Complete a game multiple times in order to obtain the true ending. I do not believe for a single moment that a game's true ending needs to be hidden behind different playthroughs of what is often a left-in game. This happens for instance in games like Fire Emblem Three Houses, where the player is asked to play essentially the same game 3 times in order to progress to the true ending. I do not like this philosophy, because I do not see why the game's true conclusion needs to be hidden out to the average player. To play a game, you truly need a lot of dedication and time, especially if the game is an RPG or involves a big open world filled with quests, so it is offensive to lock such crucial content such as the game's true ending behind hundreds of hours of gameplay. True endings can enhance the plot of a game, but I see no enhancement made if such ending is unreachable. Same logic applies for a game that requires the player to get all the collectibles or all the achievements. Mundane side activities cannot impair the narration, and I would despise it if a game asked me to constantly backtrack to progress to the true ending. Yes, I'm looking at you, Recore. These 3 types of true endings have of course different variations depending on the adventure played. However, I believe to have covered the great majority of true endings in video games. But there is one thing I have not quite addressed yet, the reason why games might have true endings. Sure, they might enhance the plot of a game, that's the whole premise of the discussion, but why do games bother to insert false endings in the first place? In the vast majority of games that have a false ending before the credits, games that end too quickly but can be continued, and games that require the player to master the title, all could theoretically avoid using false and true endings. They could all just either lock the ending entirely if the player has not achieved a specific side quest, or they could just have another in-game mechanism to rewind the adventure without the need of inserting false endings. Narrative-wise, false endings are interesting, but replaceable. In my opinion, the presence of true endings enhances the freedom of gameplay. We could debate what game's endings enhances or not a particular title from a narrative point of view, but from a gameplay perspective, I believe true endings highlight the freedom video games have in comparison to other media. In a book or in a movie, you can't simply choose wrongly. The story is told in a very linear manner and the ending is only one, But in a video game, you can mess up, you can deviate from the main narrative, you can think outside the box, so having the possibility to reach an alternative ending that is quote-unquote true of a game remarks the implicit freedom the player has when deciding the outcome of his or her own adventure. Sure, you might feel cheated when you do not reach the true ending the first time around, but the sole concept that it is up to you to decide when the game ends is freedom at its peak, and this enhances the plot of a game. True endings are peculiar in their role in a video game when it comes to enhancing the plot of a game. False endings at times definitely play a key role at developing adventure, but they can feel frustrating when you need to grind to obtain them. I would definitely judge a game's ending structure on a game-by-game basis, since true endings come in very different forms. It is definitely important to note that having a true ending to an adventure increases the sense of freedom a player has with a title. After all, you can choose when to leave a game and call it a day, regardless of the tier of the ending you reach. You can play games as you more see fit, to the true ending or not. If you made it this far, I thank you one too many endings times for watching today's video. I wish I could have made more examples to better explain my analysis, but I truly wanted to keep spoilers to zero to make the discussion more accessible. Also, speaking of good endings, the channel reached 300 subscribers not too long ago, so I wish to thank everybody who's giving me support. I hope you enjoyed this type of videos. Having said that, I wanted to invite you all to leave this video a like, to share it and to subscribe for more. I wish you all a wonderful day, and until next time, arrivederci.